Hello, folks, and welcome to Augustine's view of justice in the earthly city. I'm trying to relate peace and justice, how where there is one, you may have the other, and where the one is absent, then you're going to have the absence of the other. And then we talked a little bit, at least with Plato, how certain things are necessary as far as, elements of life's goods that are necessary for peace. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today, but we're going to expand beyond simply the fact that we need housing, we need food, and the such. And then we're going to have to ask ourselves a question as to whatever threatens this peace. That's what creates injustices, so we go after that. Now, that may seem pretty obvious, but what's obvious when we just talk about it in a sentence or theoretically isn't always obvious when it plays out on our lives, in the world, in the culture, and such. So anyway, you should really start to think about what are those things in life that lead you or I to live peacefully. Think of how we need friendship, we need safety, we need a place to live, we need art and beauty. They're very important. We need respect, we need love, etc. We can go on and on. And to the extent that we have these things and have them in their proper order, and we're able to access and enjoy them, then we have peace. So peace is that it's like a notion of harmony and true fulfillment, and it's sort of the thing that settles the soul and places the soul at rest. That's a lecture for another day, but peace is not the opposite of conflict. Just because we're not at war doesn't mean we're at peace. Just because you and your friend may not be fighting, emotionally engaged, doesn't mean that you're at peace. So peace has to mean something a little bit more than all of that. With Christianity, back in 315 AD, the Edict of Milan was issued, and that permitted Christianity to be practiced. It didn't make it the official religion of the Roman Empire, but it allowed it. And Augustine looked at that, and he really saw the merits of a strong government, like in the situation there with Constantine, in order to provide justice and peace, and then allow everybody to pursue whatever they would choose as the true good in life, and then that maintain social order. And Augustine followed various philosophers. At the time of his conversion, he was a Manichaean. Now that was a religious movement that posited this duality of light and darkness. So there's the spiritual and the material order, and these things were always in conflict with each other. And then human history is just an ongoing struggle between these two forces. And this, if nothing else, explains evil well, right? Because evil is the conflict that we're experiencing. So this question of theodicy, the why is there evil in the world? The Manichaeans could talk about it in that term. But it also directly influences understanding of justice, both in how it exists now in the heavenly city, and then how it relates to and may be experienced in the earthly city. So his probing answer never really found satisfaction, we should say. And in chapter 12 of his book Confessions, he's famously quoted as saying, that during his youth he had prayed to God, give me chastity, constancy, sexual purity, only not yet. Now, he wasn't saying that I think chastity is a good thing and I'm enjoying myself, so don't allow it to start. He knew that this was going to take some sort of conversion, and it's not just a mental assent to a particular truth. But anyway, that wasn't, again, as some think, just his desire to keep on doing whatever brought him pleasure as long as, it's possible until he has to convert. He thought physical satisfaction, things like food, especially sex, these are drives that all seek satisfaction. So when we eat, we have a particular goal. When a person engages in sexual congress, they have a particular goal. But unfortunately, these things in themselves never quench that deep desire within us. We never are totally satisfied after any of these experiences. The thirst continues. So what that means is that we have this disordered desire that's rarely extinguished. And too often, it's that thirst that remains in us when the well is full. In other words, you could still be very thirsty when you have the well near you to draw water. So that's what he referred to as the unquenchable thirst. And this conversion experience is noteworthy in consideration of this dichotomy of light and darkness. And think back to John's Gospel. Augustine was an Italian guy who he loved to party, and on most accounts he liked women more. But he had heard Bishop Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan, preach, and he was really moved by it. It just kind of hit him in his heart. And once he was out with his friend, he heard a voice. Think of a young child singing. This was his spiritual experience, and he just kept hearing the words in Latin, tolle lege, tolle lege. It means take up and read. And when he picked up the Bible and he opened it to Romans 13, verses 12 to 14, it read, The night is far gone, the day is at hand. Let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us conduct ourselves becomingly as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. Okay, so that sort of struck him. And, that's the setting then for him to go and write the City of God. And Book 19, which you were to read through, is well known for the discussion on justice. And towards the latter part of the book, the ends or the goals of the earthly city and the heavenly city. And that's what I want to at least at this point discuss. Augustine developed calculations on the verities of pursuing what one determines to be goods in life by various factors, and then they multiply each other. The point is simple. If everybody is trying so hard to reach happiness and peace, if that's what you and I are trying to do, then the way to do it is quite unsettled, because we're not really finding what we want. There's always some gap there, right? So the variety of solutions point to the fact that if there's not one way, then maybe we're not settled on how we're approaching this. But nonetheless, what he tries to do is he distills the variations for us to pursue these things down to three things. He says the first is virtue. Now, we can understand virtue here, certainly as a habit, a habitual disposition of the soul. But we can also think of it just like the art of living, like being excellent in what we do. So the art of living, it's value for the good that it brings, like all the various things that we need in life between friendship, art, beauty, and all those. Think of all those various goods, not just careers or, this. I'd like to do this for a profession, or hopefully I'll be able to get married to this person. More, general goals that we think we're going to find fulfillment from. So so virtue, this idea of the art of living, its value for those goods that it brings. He also says that we could also just really value the goods itself, and their value for the sake of virtue. So, we'll just follow the goods, but we think it's virtuous to do so. And then he said we could just also value virtue for its own sake. In other words, I just want to be that kind of person that ascribes to all these things that I consider to be good ends or, things to aim for in our particular lives. And he says, none of those really can overcome the miseries of life. I mean, if we're all pursuing those, we're still going to have plenty of things in life that we're not going to find true happiness in. At least we won't have a settled heart. And the Christian position is only that eternal life itself is the highest good, right? So, now we would say, and maybe colloquially, that this means heaven. But remember, I don't really like the idea I'm going to heaven. It's this idea of theosis, that I'm becoming like him, made more like in the Imago Dei. So the Christian position, again, is that, the highest good is this, and those things can never entirely fulfill it. But it's only in the pursuit of the good that we're going to find perfect peace. So we're on this climb looking for that. Now, it's common knowledge that this earthly life is full of misery. We all know that. Many of us are unhappy, and on so many levels, our personal peace it's disrupted, right? We have a lot of cares, a lot of concerns, and then people literally attack those things. And there's a better way that we can live in this earthly life. We sort of think that in the back of our head, but we also know it's only possible if we all orient our efforts and desires to this heavenly life. If we're all going after the same highest good, right? Choosing that as our particular goal or end. So no one can simply seek or just make for themselves a peaceful life outside of some relation to others. That's one of these myths that we have about us being such individualistic that somehow we could find peace by, getting away from others. It's only with others and in this relation of society and such that we can ever have this particular peace. So a moral life in an earthly city, it has to have a social or political end. And Augustine says that the social dimension, this is really the essence of good life. Because peace, being a supreme good, it requires relationality. And this is very deeply anthropological. Think of how I spoke about being made in God's image, and how if we share some sort of, from a Christian perspective, a Trinitarian understanding of the God who is inherently relational, and then if we image that, we can only find peace ourselves if we somehow participate in that relation. So, there's four things, or goods, that humans, all persons that is, desire naturally. And Augustine means here that they need neither a master nor instruction nor a virtue of art of living, any of those things to teach us those. He says, first of all, we all seek some sort of pleasure. Now, this could be base impulses but it could also be like aesthetical rapture. If anybody here studies psychology, or even if you might have heard of what's known as the Stendhal syndrome, the Florentine disease, it's that idea that sometimes you're in front of a particular work of art and you're just simply overcome. It's like there's something that gets saturated in your whole being. And you might think that way in a particular music, that somehow, and I don't mean this perhaps in a spiritual sense, but it almost like raptures you. It makes you stop, right? That could be one way. The other way is repose. Now, this is quiet and rest. So we should think of this particular good as having a very peaceful soul, kind of being good with who you are. He also says it can be just a combination of both this pleasure and this repose, sort of like a harmony. And the way this is done, it's by limiting our desires, right? So there was an ancient philosopher, there was an ancient philosophy, hedonism, that was just seeking pleasure. And then there's the ancient philosopher Epicurus that said, look, we have to watch if we only went after pleasure, that could lead to an unhappiness. In other words, if I drank too much, I could wind up with a hangover and a headache and everything else. So Epicurus says, maybe mitigate that. Drink some, bring pleasure, but also hold some back. So anyway, combination of pleasure and repose. We'll leave it at that. And then finally, the primary objects of nature. Now, what I mean by primary objects of nature, what Augustine means, is our own personal body integrity, that, we have a sense of our selves health-wise, that, we're in good shape. And then we also have our mental and our psychological wits about us, so that things seem to be right in that particular order. That we feel safe, both physically and mentally, and etc. So these are four goods. And remember Plato's cave. So you have this Platonic duality where there's inside of the cave. We can almost compare that to Augustine's earthly city, and then the outside of the cave, we can almost compare that to Augustine's heavenly city. So the earthly is characterized by shadows, and that just pales in comparison to the heavenly, which was everything is seen exactly as it is. But while we're in the cave, and from Augustine's point of view here on the earthly city, things are just not going to go as well as we particularly hope for the human person. Now, if we're going to talk about justice in particular, according to Augustine, he's going to say it's very difficult in this life, and in this temporal justice that we have, it doesn't always lead, remember, as a goal or an end, towards this eternal peace, this Christian position of the highest good. So it brings him to say, whatever threatens peace, therefore it's going to create an injustice. Now, again, that may seem, very, almost like underwhelming for you to hear, but if we go back and look at the particular goods, and how peace requires relationality, anything that's going to disturb any of those things, we're going to find those things to disturb our peace. And if we want to reestablish peace, we have to find some way to go back and look through that. Now, Augustine, though, he's very clear in what he lists as a list of things that would create these injustices and lack of peace. He says, when innocents are tortured, when judges condemn innocents to death, or we could say in our modern society, a person is just simply, innocently convicted. And there's the physical dangers of the world that you really can't get around. We can drive our cars and we may not be driving with any sort of carelessness, but that doesn't mean we're not going to get into an accident. There's misunderstandings between people. It could be just because how we interpret each other, or it could be how we literally don't understand each other because of language barriers, and that tends to have issues. The terrible wars. Sometimes friends are mistaken for enemies because of misunderstanding or particular calamities. Famine is one of those things in the world. Disease, captivity, the bitterness of losing ones that we love to death. Then he goes and adds the temptation of all the fallen angels who appear to mankind to tempt and deceive, right? So you can go on and read this, or you should have read it in the assignment that was to lead up to this. But Augustine says, then how does one maintain happiness made of this justice and peace in a world that is so miserable? The misery is so great that, he says what happens is that men typically prefer, mankind, the human person, prefers an unjust peace to the just peace of God. So it's almost like we realize we're not going to get the peace that we need while we're here in the earthly city, but people almost not just settle for that, they almost make that then the supreme peace. And then that just adds a whole other layer of disorientation to everything. In short, we settle for what we can get. And as long as we can get it, we're going to call that justice. Think of like the bucket list, the desire to simply live well, to get it all in. It's almost like that reconciliation that, hey, I might as well just do it because, this is it. It's not a trial run. And it's by the settling that Augustine says in the earthly city that mankind, forces earthly peace on others. In other words, you still want peace. That doesn't go away, but it's no longer the Christian highest ideal, this idea of being one with God. So we're going to find it here. So sometimes, we'll find peace be broken by wars with these shifts of powers. Think of even something like perhaps trying to use birth control to control populations in developing countries. It's that utilitarian idea that it sounds like a good idea, that somehow we have to, stave off overpopulation. But it's really saying that this particular population cannot take care of themselves, so therefore we have to step in and do what we think is best for them. It's really a form of post-colonialism. And Dorothy Day, which we'll read next week, would even call it a form of genocide. But anyway, so mankind in the light of this fall, right? And the fall is the knowing of good and evil, eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's, we have people that are grasping at power, and those that have power subjugated over others. And they only do that so they can achieve the peace in their own life. In other words, I'm going to settle. So if I can get peace by, it occurring in this earthly city with all the goods that we're trying to perhaps compete about, then I will just make sure that I get peace for myself, but it's going to be done at your own expense. So we're all the way back at the beginning of sacred scripture. We have Cain killing Abel. It's almost like this prophetic beginning, right? So all we wind up having in this particular schema is the idea of one person dominating another. And then they subjugate that other person to their own desires. So we all become slaves to others in particular arenas. And Augustine says that this slavery, it's the just desert of sin. In other words, it isn't that, he's glad that it happened, but he knows that this comes from the disorder of us not choosing the proper goods that will truly make us happy. We're settling, and he says this is it. So he's not championing it. He just recognizes that this is the result of the lack of man's peace in his own heart. And a lack of peace in our own hearts individually, this is what creates an injustice. You can see this is a little different than Plato, right, where he was looking at the larger area within the city and saying that the injustice occurs because of the unevenness and the distribution, not distribution of goods, but the fact that we all have different roles to pay, and we may not be really justly dividing up the proper compensation between those. So Augustine says it's a lust for domination, and this is what God handed over to man. He said, you want it, right? You're the one that said, I want to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge and good and evil. Okay, then fine, here you go. And then, we could almost follow, if you look up John 8:34, we read, that it's committing sin, it becomes a slave to sin. So, and all of a sudden now we're actually choosing to become a slave to particular ends that are not really going to make us happy. And again, Augustine's a pretty deep reflective thinker. So this comes after a long time of him trying to ferret out, what maybe his version of what's wrong with the world. So what we're seeing here is that, if one wants peace, then you have to be just. And you may not be able to change the system, but this isn't about that. This is about you becoming just yourself. So being just and deserving justice is really, an issue of just you choosing to be just, and I choosing to be just. And then it will manifest itself in love of neighbor. So you're never going to see a distinction, or I should say a separation, between love and justice. What does love of neighbor look like? Augustine says, if you want to know what love looks like, injure no one. Do good to everyone you can, right? So don't rule over other people. In other words, don't love power. He says, rather than love power, what you should really do is you should love mercy. And mercy and justice aren't like two different aspects of a scale where one, it's not a reality to say when you have more justice you have less mercy, and you have more mercy you have less justice. So if you want justice, you're going to have to love mercy. And justice as a virtue, remember to give the other their due. For Augustine, it has to be qualified a particular way. Like the moral virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, and such, they're not simply human activities, right? And we could probably add to that wisdom, understanding. He says they're qualified in as much as they are driven by love. So rather than these things to be searched for them in themselves, right? So we looked at the top here, virtue, goods, and virtue for its own sake. He says it all has to be driven by love. So what that really means, if we were to say, well, let's put it this way. It's about being obedient in our faith to an eternal law. And eternal law is this law in God's own mind. It's how God governs the universe. And the closer that you can understand from Augustine's eyes how God governs the universe, then that becomes an obedience to faith, not just following rules, right? We're trying to do our best to break that. So what we're seeing here is that if we're going to connect love and mercy and to peace and justice, we can say this. If prudence could be defined as right action in any given circumstance, here then, love is that thing which discerns whatever leads ourselves to God in every circumstance. So that becomes the governing force. If we say temperance is some way to moderate sex and food, things that we need, then love in the midst of those things will keep us steadfast and it'll help our love be directly ordered so those things don't become obstacles to our search for God. If justice then is to give another their due, then love is this ask first what is due to God. And then that becomes a sense of justice, not just simply what we look as whether or not I am getting what is my due, which is often, unfortunately, what most of us do. And if fortitude is like being steadfast in the light of a future difficult good, then love, says, undergo the test. Take whatever, we're going to suffer these injustices, but that's what fortitude will do. It'll help at least us over that hill, if we want to talk about it in that way. So the righteous people, they don't seek peace as earthly advantages over other people, but they relate all the earthly advantages of this one true peace, which is perfectly ordered, and it's the harmonious enjoyment of God, and of course one another in God. That's the relational aspect of it. He goes on to say, and we're wrapping up here, in the earthly city, he says, we seek an earthly peace, and we make use of this peace until our mortal condition, which necessitates it, shall pass away. So he's almost turning to Platonic notions here, where there's like this true and this real. It could be reached. Remember, if you're inside the cave, you want to get outside the cave where those things are in their perfection. If you remember the scenario, that individual that was released from the wall, once they started acclimating to the shadows within the cave, they had to be drug out. They didn't go out on their own. So in this sense, Augustine says, maybe we too need to be drug out for the true and the real, this experience. And it can never be fully experienced in the here and the now in the earthly city with inside the cave. And this is where he comes in and says, about my heart is restless until it finds rest in you, O God. It's this restless heart. It's this notion that arises out of all of this. The perfection of the cave is not experienced in this life, or I should say the perfection outside the cave is not experienced in this life, but that doesn't mean that we don't strive for that, and that becomes our goal or our end. This leaves each of us with a very restless heart, but our heart will never find rest within these realms because it belongs to and in the love of God. And outside of giving God his due, which is the basis of all this justice, there then could be no justice in man or in society. So, I hope that does it. Any questions? We can go over it when I'm back in class. Ciao.